Hello everybody, in today's video I'm going to show you how I made a blue 1940s dress from an original pattern. The pattern I'm using is an original vintage pattern and I date it to about 1946. It came with very few instructions on the back side. It just tells me that there are printed letters on each pattern piece. I have to connect the patterns with the letters. Means A to A and B goes to B and C to C and so on. Let's start with all the pieces of the pattern first. So first I have the main bodice in the front. It's all one piece and gets gathered down at the waist. And it already has the collar attached to it, so it will just fold over itself. The next pattern piece is the back bodice, and it's gathered in the waist with two pleats, and it's also cut and fold. Then there is the collar, and it gets sewn on the outer edge of the front piece, so it's the part that will be facing outwards on the finished garment. Moving on to the skirt, we have the asymmetrical front piece, which is just cut on a single layer since it's asymmetrical, and it has the full length. The other parts are separated, so there is underskirt piece and also an upper skirt. So there is a seam line going horizontally just about height of the waist. Now here's one of the upper skirt pieces, how I call them. And this one is for the back, and it's also cut and fold. And here is the same one just for the front, and it's just cut one time because the skirt in the front is asymmetrical, and so I did cut the front skirt panel just one time and also this one. And the last and biggest part of the dress was the main skirt, more or less the bottom part of the skirt. Because it's gathered on the top, it was so wide that I had to piece it together because my fabric was too narrow. But I didn't worry much about it because the side seams wouldn't be aligned anyway, and also piecing is period, also in the 40s where limited fabric was also very prominent. So let's move on to the construction, shall we? I didn't film footage of making the bodice part with the real fabric, so the mock-up footage should work. What I did first was making the two back pleats. They were marked on the pattern and I just made it as it is. Pinned them in place and sewed over it just to keep it in place. Then the pattern told me to work on the collar on the outer side of the collar, and I pinned everything together on the outer edge and sewed around it, starting basically from the waist of the front of one side of the front, working on my way to the neck and down again. What I did on the real garment was I extended the facing of the collar until the waist, because in the pattern it was just shown that it will just sit a little bit under the point where the collar folds over, and I didn't want that. I wanted it to be connected with the waist, so I have a sturdy facing for the button and buttonholes as well. And with every facing, the seam allowance gets trimmed down, especially at the corners so they turn over nicely. And the curved edges will just be clipped. I clip it all the way to the seam but not actually cutting a thread, and it will turn over smoothly. Now on to attaching the front to the back piece. So I had the instructions on a pattern, as I told you before, so I had to figure it out myself, and it was a little bit tricky actually. So the neck hole of the back gets attached to more or less the underside of the collar. Then the edges are clipped, like the corners are clipped away, so you can sew just with one stitching line the neck and the shoulder seam. It's a little bit confusing, I know, I didn't get it the first time, but it makes sense, and we'll see it on the final garment a little bit more detailed. It kind of forms a corner at the back of your neck. So finally a footage of the garment in the real fabric. It's a nice blue polyester fabric, and it's vintage from my grandmother, so it should be accurate more or less. Yeah, I'm at the same point as it was with my mock-up. The color is already done up. And here you can see the back again. So you kind of attach the back side to the underside of the collar and then go over into the shoulder seam. And here are the back pleats again. And the real garment, because the fabric is very slippery, I basted them so they stay. And a little bit of the inside. I finished the shoulder seams by just folding it over and edge stitching it. The collar got basted together so it's nice and secure, and I also pasted a facing to the bodice where the buttonholes will be, and slip stitched the other part so it's invisible from the outside. On the shoulder seam I attached the collar very firmly with whip stitch, and on the back it's just hanging loose. As the next step I finished the sleeves, the hem of the sleeves, with a simple slip stitch, which was totally accurate for the time. It means that on the outside of the garment you don't see a stitch, or depending on the fabric, very little of the stitching. But the trick with the slip stitch is that you just stitch into one thread of the fabric. The only thing you see from the outside is maybe a little bit of puckering depending on the fabric. But if you use a heavier fabric, you don't even have this. You see basically nothing. Since I had a very flowy and light fabric, I did see a little bit of the stitching, but not too much. After that, I was ready to sew the side seams, and since the sleeves are part of the bodice, there is a very curved underarm seam. So you have to clip the seam allowance in order for that to lay smoothly, which means that you have all those fraying edges on the inside. So I did use an interesting method to finish this, but I don't think it's inaccurate. So for most part of it, I used the same method as I used for my shoulder seams, and it was just folding the seam allowance in half and stitching very close to the edge. So for finishing the clipped parts of the seam allowance. I did this by hand. I think it's very inefficient doing this by machine. You just end up with having to seam rip it and sew it again and everything. So I would just do it by hand. It's quicker for me, at least. So as you can see in the footage, I just stitched around the clipped edges very closely, so I kind of encase the raw edge with threads. And I did go around the first raw edge, and then just continued with the same thread to the other one and to the other one, and then move the needle over, like traveled the needle over to the other side, and did the same thing again until my thread runs out, obviously. And I also attached the seam allowance to the hem of the armhole, so it doesn't flap around too much or even shows at the outside. You don't want that. What I did to the sleeves is I gathered them up at the shoulder seam, because due to the pattern, I guess, it looked kind of funny when I put the dress on. After that, the bodice was done so far, I moved on to the skirt. So since I had a lot of skirt panels, because I pieced the white one, I had to sew them together. And in a sewing book from the 40s, it suggested that if you have a very light fabric, you should use French seams. So you pin the fabrics wrong-sided together. Then you sew where you pinned the fabric, and you sew basically half the seam allowance you have away. Like I had 1 centimeter, so I did sew my seam half a centimeter away from the edge of the fabric. After that, you trim the seam allowance away, not fully away. You trim maybe the half of it away, so if you encase it in the next step, it doesn't show through. It's a little bit complicated. There are way better tutorials for French seams, but I hope this gives you a little bit of insight. To make them look a little bit smoother on the inside, I always press my French seams open. Many people just wiggle it around with the fingers and sewing it like that, but I really don't like that. I like to have a nice flat seam on the inside as well. And then you sew the other side. So you fold the raw edge kind of inward. You sew along the edge the other half of the seam allowance. Like I sewed away half a centimeter, now you're gonna take another half centimeter, and since you trimmed away the excess seam allowance, you encase basically a quarter of the seam allowance in the seam you're making right now. Yes, that's very complicated, but I hope you will get it. I've done the French seams to all my skirt panels that get gathered up at the end, so the lower skirt pieces. And they turned out a little bit wrinkly, but I will get that away with pressing them very firmly. So then I could move on to gathering the lower skirt. And for that I lowered my thread tension to around 2, so it gathers more easily. You can pull the bobbin threads afterwards, and it really gathers very nicely. So I just sewed with a very long stitch all around the top of my lower skirt, which will all be gathered down. And I sewed 2 rows of stitching, although I just filmed the first row, but there are 2 in the end. So this kind of stabilizes the ruffles a little bit and makes them more straight. So the front of the asymmetrical part, the part where the buttonholes will go, I finished up with a facing and basted it down so it lay smoothly throughout the process of making the dress. And the back piece gets connected with a French seam as well. And it also gets connected to the other asymmetrical front piece I showed you in the very beginning. What the pattern told me to do was making a pleat where the front piece is attached to the wider skirt, so it kind of hides the seam where you connect these two, which is very clever, I have to say. It really doesn't really help me because I had the piecing seams anyway, so you did see some seams, but it did hide this one seam, and it actually makes it a little bit flowy on the front, which is nice. So I could start a very tedious process of gathering this very wide skirt panel up. And I like my gathers to be relatively precise, so I take my time for that there isn't more gathers on one side and less volume on the other. So I really like to spread it out evenly and take my time for that, especially if it's that prominent in the final piece. Then I obviously pinned all my gathers to the upper skirt piece and made sure that all the piecing seams are the same distance on both sides. Then I could start to stitch it up. Since I didn't know how I should finish this seam, I stitched it up with an edge stitch by hand, which was also suggested in my sewing book from the 40s. So when this was all done up, I tried the skirt on, and I noticed that the upper part of the skirt is a little bit too long for me. So I shortened it around the waist and pinned it, and now I basted the crease I made. So I have a line where I can attach the bodice to the skirt. So with the bodice I did the same. I tried it on and I marked out where my waist is with some pins and drew that line with chalk when the bodice laid flat on my desk. So I could also transfer it to the other side with some copying paper. And so you have a line where you first gather the top and then baste and eventually sew the skirt to the bodice. So I had my markings on the bodice and on the skirt, which means I could start basting the two separate pieces together. And I always based my waistline because honestly I hate sewing the waistline. It always ends up kind of wonky or isn't really my waist. So I do this multiple times usually and paste it together to see what it looks like so I don't have to rip it out again. After pasting the waist together, I started sewing it and then tried it on. So since I hate waistline so much, I always make sure to try it on before I trim anything, and I was right as usual. It was still like too long on both sides, so I had to shorten it quite a big amount. I marked it again with some pins and then I compared it to the other side, so I make sure I reduce the same amount on both sides. I marked a new line where I sew and sewed around it, tried it on again, and made some more alteration, which I haven't filmed anymore because the frustration got a little bit big to pick up the camera. But eventually it worked out and I could start trimming the seam allowance of the waist away and finishing that seam as well. I finished it with the same technique I finished my shoulder seams, turning the seam allowance over, like folding it in half and then stitch very close to that. And now to the final parts, which is hem and closure. I made buttonholes, 6 buttonholes, and sewed on buttons, but I did it in the evening in front of the TV, so I don't have footage of that. Those are hand-stitched buttonholes. I can't really show you how it works. It's just practicing and practicing and practicing, and mine aren't beautiful either. So the final part of the dress is the hem, and I did this as I always do this. I laid a dress flat on my floor with the center front on the left side and the center back on the right side, and pin all the seams together to ensure I cut symmetrical. And then I trim everything that's wonky off basically, or shorten it, but in this case I didn't really need to shorten it. So when I cut it, I did go over to my sewing machine and folded 1 centimeter over and sewed all around the hem. I did this by eye and it totally works for me. If you practice more, sewing 1 centimeter by eye goes quite easily. It's not as accurate if you would mark it out, but it works too, and it really doesn't matter if you have a very wide skirt. For the next part of the hem I did mark it out, and I marked 2 centimeters away from where I stitched and folded everything over again and pressed it down, so I have a 1 centimeter hem. And I did hand stitch the hem as I usually do with a slip stitch. So like I always do with a slip stitch, I try to catch just one thread of the fabric and stitch through the hem I made, and then go on around the whole dress. And since I had two buttons left, I decided to make a little detail on the sleeves and sewed on those two buttons quite firmly, just for decorative purposes. And with that, the dress was done. I hope you enjoyed this little video I made. Well, it's quite a long video actually, but if you come this far, thanks for watching, and I hope I see you on my next video I'm making. So please subscribe if you liked it, or give it a thumbs up or a comment.